Hi everyone. Hello. Hi everyone. Is it working? Is it working? Hello. Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Jeffrey Blay, a second-year Master of Environmental Science student from Professor Sito's lab, and also a member of BIOMES committee. So I'll be introducing our guest speaker for today shortly. But before I introduce our guest speaker for today, I'll briefly touch on the mandate of the biomes and then our main goal as a committee. And then also those that are joining from joining us online, you can post your suggestions and your questions in the Q&A session. So the biomes basically is a YSE flagship seminar series featuring community-sourced, interdisciplinary presentations on research, policy, and activism surrounding environmental issues. And our main goal as a committee is to inspire and inform conversations within the YSE community. So our guest speaker for today is a Global Development Leader and a 2022 Yale World Fellow. He manages the African Development Bank's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. His UN-related work has focused on sustainable development, poverty reduction, and global food security. He has delivered development assistance in over 80 countries worldwide. He holds a PhD in development economics from the University of Sussex. He has held prestigious fellowships at Stanford, the Ford Foundation, the International Development Research Center, and the International Science Council. Fellow YSE, as I introduced to you, Babatunde Omilola.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here to join you all for this conversation today. I hope you can all hear me. Fantastic. Okay, yeah, so let me first and foremost thank you for inviting me to talk to you on the topic of accelerating sustainable development in the era of COVID, conflict, and the climate. Now, I don't have PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to try to structure my conversation around 4 different areas. The first area would be the unfinished business of the MDG agenda, the Millennium Development Goals. And then I will zoom in into conversations around the Sustainable Development Goals. Then thirdly, I will focus on how the current unprecedented crisis that we are witnessing around the world, how they are affecting the acceleration of the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, I will conclude with some actions on what we need to do collectively at the level of the private sector, public sector, governments, but also academia, such as Yale University, what we should all be doing to deal with all of these crises in order for us to accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, let me begin on the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals. As you all know, the Millennium Development Goals, there were 8 of them. These 8 development goals, at the time that they were formulated, they had 60 official indicators to basically monitor them and track them. The focus of the Millennium Development Goals was on developing countries, poor countries, countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Now, in terms of those Millennium Development Goals, at the time that they were crafted, the idea was really to help developing countries to be able to reduce poverty, to reduce hunger, but also to deal with maternal mortality issues, deal with infant mortality, but also environmental sustainability. That was goal 7 of those 8 goals at that time. But what we saw at that time was that goal 7 around environmental sustainability was not actually focused on many of the developing countries where we worked. I had the privilege at that time to be the United Nations Development Program regional practice leader for poverty reduction and the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals in Africa. And at that time, what we did was to engage African countries to look at those 8 Millennium Development Goals and see which of them they would consider in different African countries as lagging MDGs, those that are not likely to be met by 2015 at that time. And it would surprise you to know that in many African countries where I worked at that time, the lagging MDG for most of them was MDG 5, which is on how to improve maternal health, basically to reduce maternal mortality. Even in advanced countries such as South Africa and many other middle-income countries in Africa, a lot of women were dying trying to give birth to children. And so our focus at that time was really to come up with action plans on how to address maternal mortality issue in many African countries. We did this very well. And so environmental sustainability, which was Goal 7, was never really paid sufficient attention to. What we did to help African countries at that time was to come up with what we call the MDG Acceleration Framework, which we formulated in 2010. And we used the MDG Acceleration Framework basically to help countries address those lagging MDGs, come up with action plans, and came up also with the ideas of how you can build a stakeholder community in different African countries. Now, also at that time, we began to have conversation on what post-2015 development agenda would look like. And that led to a lot of intergovernmental negotiations around the Sustainable Development Goals. So now, fast forward, in 2015, I moved to New York for UNDP as the global head for development planning, primarily responsible for formulating, monitoring, and also implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. While we were formulating the Sustainable Development Goals, we looked at what the whole world should be doing, that the Sustainable Development Goals should not just be about developing countries. It should be about the entire world. It should be inclusive. It should also be holistic by looking at the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of development, especially what we neglected to do during the MDG era, which was to pay some attention to environmental sustainability around the world. And as a result of that, we came up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 232 indicators to monitor them, as well as different targets, 169 targets around the world. And when we came up with that, we basically looked at what should happen around the world. And we saw that financing was a big gap for development. So one of the first things we did was to have an international conference in July of 2015 in Addis Ababa on financing for development. Then after that, we had the Sustainable Development Goals Summit at the level of the United Nations, where all global leaders came in 2015. And that, of course, led to the endorsement of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, through which you are able to ensure that social, environmental, and economic dimensions of development were embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so since 2015, we have been implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, but before the end of 2015, we also spoke a lot about the adverse effects of climate change. And that led to the Paris Climate Agreement in December of 2015 to make sure that we deal with the devastating effects of climate change around the world. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, you would see that SDG 13 is on addressing climate action around the world. And so we began to implement, support countries around the Sustainable Development Goals. We crafted what we call the roadmap for SDG implementation in different countries. I personally visited several countries around the world, helping them to mainstream the SDGs into their own national development priorities and goals. I visited countries as far as Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan, United Arab Emirates, Uganda, and many of them around the world, just helping them to ensure that they will be able to mainstream the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and address holistically all the kinds of development issues that we are facing around the world. Now, let me come to the third part of the conversation, which is actually the main reason why we are here today. The fact that despite the fact that we did so well to accelerate the implementation of those Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, we then encountered several crises in the world, starting, of course, with the COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 crisis, as you see it today, has actually pushed about 93 million people into extreme poverty around the world in 2020 alone. In Africa, 30 million people were pushed into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And not only that, it has also reversed the gains that we had in terms of poverty reduction, 4 years of poverty reduction gain that we had in the world as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a big deal for us and for the entire global community. In addition to these, we have countries facing looming debts, countries facing inflation and all kinds of crises precipitating as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic has done was basically to create spin-off effects in terms of health, education, nutrition, environment, peace, and security around the world. And so this becomes a big deal. In Africa, where I come from, what we saw was that Africa entered recession after 20 years of unprecedented growth on the continent due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, conflict, again, also came into the picture. The idea of conflict is not just about the war ongoing in Ukraine, it's about all kinds of conflicts. In fact, 1/4 of the global population today live in countries where there are conflicts. We have a global community where violent conflicts have never been on the rise as we see now since 1946. Basically. So which means conflict is a big deal. Now, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has done so much damage in terms of food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis. I'll give you some statistics very, very quickly. Now, in terms of Russia and Ukraine, these two countries, they produce 30% of world traded wheat that are consumed. And 26 countries around the world, they basically, half of their wheat come from Russia and Ukraine. And so this is a big deal around the world. Now, in terms of fertilizers production, Russia, Ukraine, and also Belarus, which is of course an ally of Russia, these are major fertilizer producers in the world. So which means the conflict ongoing in that part of the world is actually affecting the entire global community in terms of looming global food insecurity. And that for us is a big deal. And as a result of this, the United States government, USAID, through USAID, United States Agency for International Development, they basically made a promise, a commitment of about $750 million to support countries, particularly in the global south, in terms of dealing with poverty, malnutrition, agricultural development. For me, for the African Development Bank, where I currently work, we basically put together a $1.5 billion food emergency support for Africa in order to support production in Africa. So this for us is a big deal because we have to deal with food insecurity. Now, the third crisis that is affecting all of us globally is crisis relating to climate change. Climate change is a big deal. It's a big deal in many countries, especially in countries that really do not contribute so much to the global climate change that we see. Africa, for instance, contributes only 43% of the greenhouse gas emissions totally worldwide. And yet, Africa bears most of the brunt of climate change issues. And for us, this becomes something that we need to address. In terms of climate change, what we are saying is that if we are going to deal with increased heat waves, apocalyptic wildfires, droughts, as well as floods that are already affecting billions of people around the world, we would need to ensure that by 2025, the global greenhouse gas emissions will reach its peak and then should be able to decline to around 43% by 2030 and then get to a net zero by 2050. That's where we should be heading. But unfortunately, the evidence that we currently have shows that it's going to increase by 14% by 2030, which means it's a big deal for us to deal with issues of climate change. Now, what is one of major systems in the world that is causing most of this? Agriculture. Agriculture. I spent the first part of my career working on agriculture and food security. I worked in some of the world's best institutions on food and agriculture. I was with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. I was also with the International Food Policy Research Institute. What you will see is that in the world, we say that there are still many hungry people. According to our estimates, there are 828 million people that go to bed hungry every night around the world. That's a staggering statistic. And yet, in the same world, 1/3 of food that we produce is either wasted or lost in terms of post-harvest losses from where they are produced to get to where they should be consumed, or in terms of how we waste food around the world. And when we produce food, we use water, we use land. Some of the best world fresh water is used to produce food, and yet we waste 1/3, or 1/3 of this food is lost before they get to people to consume them. So that also becomes a big deal because we are not able to have sustainable production and sustainable consumption of food that we produce. And that's why when you look at the statistics, you would also see that agriculture is contributing to around between 20 to 25% greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural production, it's because of the way we currently cultivate, we currently produce food that we consume around the world. And all of these have effects for climate change. So we have all of these crises looking at us. And these crises are not only spinning off other crises in the area of education. Take education, for instance, where 24 million learners, students, are not likely to return back to school as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, whether from preschool year or to university level. And that's a big deal. And so when you look at all of these crises happening around the world, we know that we have confluence of crises that we need to address. We also look at some of the estimates of what is going on around the world. And we see that climate change in particular is likely going to lead to around additional 250,000 deaths every year from 2030 to 2050, especially as a result of malaria, as a result of diarrhea, and many other illnesses and diseases around the world. So what is my point, really? My point is that the world is facing unprecedented crises. And these crises are affecting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been crafted as our roadmap to enable us to get into 2030. And so we need to urgently take action. We need to do something about this. These crises are many, and so there will be concerted efforts, joint actions by all stakeholders, by all actors whether in developing countries or developed countries, whether private sector or government or the academia or the media, everyone or think tanks must play a role to deal with these challenges. So now let me try to go now to the fourth part of my conversation with you today, which will be, what are these actions that we should be taking? The first action that we should be taking, for me, will be we need to focus on the vulnerable around the world. The vulnerable people, vulnerable communities, vulnerable places around the world. I will tell you why we need to do this. When we witnessed cyclone in Africa a few years ago, especially in Mozambique, there is a place in Mozambique called Beira. In that place, the cyclone Adai that was witnessed really devastated the people, especially the communities, their livelihoods, their well-being. And so it becomes very important, despite the fact that they had in place measures to deal with floods and to deal, the drainage system was effective, everything was there, but yet the devastation was huge for them. And this is similar in many other communities, whether you talk about Bangladesh, where people are thinking that maybe in the foreseeable future, the whole, Dhaka and other parts are likely going to sink, or other parts of the world. So the idea is to focus on the vulnerable, whether it is through agricultural production, where 43% of smallholders in the world are women in developing countries. So we need to focus on addressing the issues of the vulnerable people, especially women, children, and also those communities that are not likely to support themselves. So this is fundamental. This is the number one thing that needs to be done, looking at all the confluence of crises that we face. Number two, in my view, we need to look at social protection systems. Social protection systems are extremely important, not only in terms of providing social safety nets for people, but also in terms of safeguarding people against this crisis, even now and in the future. Number three, we need to improve public services delivery in many countries where we know them. And number four, especially in terms of climate change adaptation and resilience become very, very important in many countries. The bad news is that global leaders, they have many meetings, especially through COP. Now we are going to COP 27. We are going to Egypt, and then there will be COP 28 in United Arab Emirates. So all of these conversations have been going. The rich countries, they promised African countries, for instance, about $100 million to support climate change adaptation. But in reality, that has not translated into what should be. Where I work for currently, the African Development Bank, we have been working with the Global Center on Adaptation, which is based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, to deal with climate change adaptation in Africa, with a promise of trying to get $25 billion for that. And so far, we have been able to mobilize $12.5 billion for climate change adaptation. So this becomes very important for communities, for countries to be able to adapt to climate change issues that they are facing, whether droughts or floods and any other kind of crisis that they are facing. Number four, which is also related to what I said about climate change adaptation, is about climate change finance. Climate finance becomes important. And that's why multilateral development banks and many other financial institutions need to come into play to make sure that we have the kinds of finance that is needed to really deal with issues surrounding climate, but not only climate, but generally in terms of all the issues that I've laid out today. And I think another thing that is also needed is the ability to connect the dots. To connect the dots, meaning to bring all the key stakeholders, into the whole action. Because this is not something you leave to governments alone. And that leads me towards universities, research organizations should be doing. I think it's not enough for you to come up with evidence that is needed. You need to also come up with how the evidence can make it into policy making in countries where they're needed, especially in terms of improving the reactions and also policies for countries. So that is important. More investment in data is needed. Information infrastructure in countries will be needed, especially data that are disaggregated at all levels, so that you'll be able to see what is going on where and why, and then be able to profile solutions based on the context, based on the particularities of different communities, different countries, and different societies. So all of these are really badly needed in the world that we live in today. And I think finally, I want to say that the Sustainable Development Goals, they provide us with a compass through which most of the issues that we face in the world can be met, because they are holistic, they cut across the entire world, whether developing countries or developed countries. They deal with social, economic, and environmental dimensions of development. And so we should invest more in making sure we are able to track them, we are able to support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals around the world. And of course, this becomes more important now than any other time else, because this will guide us until 2030. And as we move into 2050, where the global population is likely going to be 10 billion or more people around the world, it means that our challenges are going to proliferate. And for us to deal with these challenges, we need to have a compass that can guide us. And that compass needs to have clear roadmaps in different places with clear direction, clear financing on how we can be able to deal with all of these crises that are facing the world. But let me conclude that the world has never faced this kind of challenges that we are facing right now, because we have one of the largest refugee crises resulting as a result of the as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. And also, there are pockets of violent conflicts going on around the world that are not even reported in the media. You look at the example of the Tigray war going on in Ethiopia, which the media, especially Western media, is generally silent about. And you look at so many other places where there are conflicts. And some of these conflicts, they are not just about political power. They are conflicts about environmental resources. They are conflicts about land. There are conflicts about water resources. So there are all kinds of conflicts that when you look at them, you see that they also affect our environment one way or another. So you are in the school of the environment. And so what it means is that you have to triangulate the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development to be able to deal with the issues that affect our environment, so that we can create a meaningful life here for people, for the planet where we live on, and for peace and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
So with COP27, what do you hope to see come from that? This could be a landmark COP, it could be a flop. It's kind of a 50-50, but if you were in charge of COP27, what would you like to see emphasized comes from that meeting?
Very, very good question. I think I answered it partly during my presentation, but what I would like to see will be some of the promises that have been made in the past COPs should be redeemed. The $100 billion promised on climate change adaptation, for instance, it would be good to see some traction in terms of how some of these promises will be kept. So basically, there have been, I wouldn't like COP27 to be another talk show, to be another, people come in, everybody talks, makes promises, and then disappear, but no action. So this should be about finance, finance, finance. What is needed is really climate finance, as you speak, to deal with climate change adaptation, to deal with resilience, but also to deal with the other aspects that countries, especially in the global south, are facing. So I would like to see many of the promises of the past being fulfilled.
So I've been working for several years now in the development research space, and I know you spoke a bit about having research that's more policy focused and can be used by people at African Development Bank. And so I'm curious if you have more specific recommendations for those of us in academia right now trying to create those recommendations for like the AFDB right now, given these challenges. And then also, I think if I heard you correctly, you worked at IFPRI before this as well. So what does an institution like Yale, a very academic institution, have to offer that IFPRI doesn't, like a more professional research institute?
Yeah, thanks very much. We still don't have enough evidence in terms of what is going on in different contexts, different societies, different communities. So I think for me, I would like to see more evidence, more research, more knowledge in terms of what is going on in different places on climate change issues. And then not only that we produce such evidence, but how the evidence can be used for policy making. During my days at IFPRI, one of the things that we did well at IFPRI was ability to articulate our research findings for policy making in developing countries. And I think I find that very useful. And I think that's what even universities, academia, and think tanks should be doing more and more. There is still a serious knowledge gap, in terms of information infrastructure in many countries. People don't know what's going on. You take Nigeria, where I come from, I'm a Nigerian citizen. There has been flood in different parts of Nigeria in the last few weeks, even affecting some of the most serious elites of the country, including a former president of the country who could not even get into his house anymore. His house is totally gone because of flood. Now, the idea is that we need more analysis, more knowledge, but those knowledge should filter into policy making, into what can concretely be done. It should not just be research for the sake of research. So that's the point.
Thanks so much for your great talk. I'd love to hear you say a bit more about the role of multilateral development banks as institutions in regional cooperation. I mean, you stressed some of these crises that cross boundaries, whether they're environmental or refugee movements, and yet it seems like MDBs are mostly working with individual client countries. And so I just wonder if you see headroom for MDBs doing more to facilitate regional cooperation or to mediate conflicts between and among member states, whether there's a best practice example that you'd like to see more of, or an example of something that you think an institution like the ADB should, the African Development Bank should be doing but isn't doing. Any comments on that would be very interesting.
Yeah, thanks very much. Excellent question. MDBs, they are set up primarily to provide financing, right, in different areas. Like the African Development Bank, we are set up to really provide finance for countries, but when there are crises, we also step in. But then there are also other organs, like the African Union, which is the main convener of all the countries, in Africa, for instance, just similar to what you have in Europe, European Union. And then they are more able to convene countries, to guide them, to do mediation. So I think MDBs cannot encroach into that territory. But nevertheless, MDBs can collaborate and cooperate with those organs. And we have been doing that very well at the African Development Bank, working with the African Union Commission, working with the regional economic communities in Africa. There are many of them. In fact, during the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, which I managed for the African Development Bank, we put together a $10 billion COVID-19 crisis response facility. And we just didn't finance only individual African countries, but we also engaged regional economic communities. In fact, for all the regional economic communities in Africa, we provided them with grants through our African Development Fund financial instrument. And those grants, basically, we use those grants to convene them, to engage in regional cooperation, how to combat the pandemic in Africa. And you would see that that really went a long way. We also provided some grants for the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to be able to deal with the pandemic. So we have been doing that, engaging with the regional economic communities, building the capacities, of these institutions, but also engaging them in dialogue. But there is a limit to what we can do in terms of mediating around peace and security or refugee crisis. So most of that, of course, would have to be done by the African Union itself, those regional economic communities, and also relevant UN agencies that should be playing that role, like the UN Refugee Agency. But one of the things that we do well, we provide the finance needed, even for those organizations, even for this COVID-19 pandemic. We leveraged about, I think, $48 million in terms of grants to the World Health Organization to be able to help us coordinate the regional economic communities. We also extended some grant to the UN Refugee Agency to deal with the Sahel, those G5 countries in the Sahel. So I think we have been doing that as African Development Bank, and I think most MDBs are doing this. But what is important is to understand the roles and responsibilities of different actors and stakeholders and see areas for mutual collaboration.
Firstly, thank you so much for being here. Your talk was amazing. I have a question about some of the agricultural and kind of global violence themes that you were talking about. So it definitely seems as though this rise in global violence that you mentioned a few times through your talk is tied very tangibly to a rise in food insecurity. And I'm wondering how you're looking at projects either in specific countries in Africa or over the African continent in general, in terms of building food resilience. Because at least my understanding of agriculture and the way that especially Western influences have participated in agriculture in Africa, it has been really focused on quantity as opposed to resilient systems and building kind of like local economies and local systems that could withstand something like this wheat crisis that's happening as a result of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. So I'm wondering what you think of in terms of building these resilient systems, if you think that this is something that we need to focus on, and how you think that, like outside groups from the United States, for example, could better participate in building those resilient systems than focusing just on quantity or on GMO agriculture or on the implementation of kind of experimental ideas that come from our side without, from my understanding, taking into account really the context of the African side.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's precisely what we are doing. When we set up the 1.5 billion food emergency support for African countries as a result of the war in Ukraine, it was to build food resilience in Africa, to support production, but also to work along the entire value chain, from production to consumption. Help farmers provide the seeds that they would need, especially drought-resistant seeds where they are needed, fertilizer production. So that is precisely what we have been doing. But another thing that is happening is that some countries still depend so much on food aid. And we believe strongly that food aid will not take people permanently out of hunger, especially when 828 million people still go to bed hungry every night. And food aid, the story, it's actually a very, it has a dichotomy to it. You know, like in the global north, let's say in North America and Europe, about $600 billion go into providing subsidy to farmers in the global north, right? Every year. And now a lot of what is produced that is not consumed gets its way through food aid to countries in Africa and other parts of developing countries. And that, in a way, distorts local production of food because of the prices and all of that. And that, in a way, also affects food resilience. So that's one dichotomy, the way we look at it. The other thing is that countries themselves must be food sufficient. And for them to be food sufficient, you need to build that food resilience. And that's precisely what we have been doing in Africa. And we also have what we call the Feed Africa strategy, which is helping us to do this. But in addition to that, we are not just looking into food security, we are also looking into how to address malnutrition. Because African economies, they are losing about $25 billion every year as a result of malnutrition. So I'm also leading the nutrition work of the African Development Bank. And what we do from there, we have been able to catalyze about $2.8 billion nutrition smart investments, so that every investment that we do in every critical sector, whether it's in food security, health, social protection, water and sanitation, you have an element that will address malnutrition in Africa. And that's precisely what we are doing, and that's what is needed in order to be able to stave off hunger and food insecurity in Africa, and for Africa to be food sufficient.
We have can you hear me? Yes. We have a question from Dr. Gordon Gabal, who's tuning in via Zoom. He says, thank you for the wide-ranging talk. Can you address transnational boundary climate migration? The SDGs focus within country actions, but migration is and will be a big problem.
Yeah, migration, it's also one of the things that would remain with us. Right now, as a result of all these crises that I spoke about, especially the conflict going on, 100 million people have been forcibly displaced, and this is also part of the migration issue. So now what can be done will be concerted efforts by all governments concerned to make sure that migrants are seen as human beings. They are seen as human beings who are basically looking for their own livelihoods, well-being. And so if that is taken into consideration in terms of policies, that could help a lot of issues around migration. But of course, migration is part of the whole equation. It's part of what we see in terms of the refugee crisis. It's part of what we see as people move from one part to another, but basically looking for their own survival. And so it is part of the equation. But as African Development Bank, we don't deal expressly on issues of migration directly, but of course we support many African countries if this is part of their policies or is in their development goals. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Apologies if you already addressed this, I had to come a little bit late, but I would love to hear a little bit about the kinds of conversations happening within development banks around financing fossil fuels. I know that the African Development Bank explicitly came out and said it would not be financing the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which, if constructed, would be the world's longest heated oil pipeline. But the Islamic Development Bank has come in to provide financing for this pipeline. And so, yeah, I would love to hear about conversations that are happening in this space about whether to finance fossil fuel projects or not.
Well, my answer to you on this is that the African Development Bank is governed by two boards. You have the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank. The Board of Governors are basically the ministers of finance in their different countries. And then you have the Board of Executive Directors, 20 of them, that are residents in Abidjan, the headquarters of African Development Bank. So decisions about what the bank can fund or cannot fund, those decisions are taken at the level of the board of the bank, right? Now, in terms of the board of the bank, the way it is composed, there are 81 member countries of the African Development Bank, and 54 of them are African countries. We call them regional member countries. Then you have 27 that are non-regional member countries, including the US, Canada, Japan, China, as far back as even Argentina and many other countries, right? So now, the decision on what to be funded and what not to be funded is usually taken at the level of the board for whatever reason. So let me leave that answer there that way. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for the incredible talk. I really appreciated the action points you shared, and I just wanted to highlight the first one especially, which was, you mentioned focusing on vulnerable people. And my question really is on how that relates to addressing power dynamics specifically. My experience is mostly local, so in the eastern province of Zambia, where a lot of the time mostly when I attended leadership meetings, they were predominantly men at the meetings. However, when I attended trainings on smallholder farming plots, it's predominantly women that were at these meetings. So my question really is, I think they are inherent power dynamics, and I'm curious how you think we should address these power dynamics to bring the most vulnerable people to the table and ensure that their voices are heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very wonderful question. One of the things that we do at the African Development Bank is we actually have a department on gender, women, and civil society, basically to bring women into the picture. We have a strategy on women for Africa in order to make sure women are part and parcel of the conversations, the process, and development outcomes wherever they are on the continent. And we have specific financial instruments targeting only women entrepreneurs, whether they are women smallholders in agriculture or in other aspects of life in Africa. And we have what they call the AFAWA, which is the Affirmative Action Plan for Women in Africa. Just targeting women, because we know that a lot of them, they lack access to credit, to finance, to do what they need to do. It's just making sure that women are taken care of. So we believe so much in this, but of course, there has been, historically, women have been sidelined in many places, and we recognize that. And so we are doing everything that we can do to make sure that women are also part and parcel of the whole equation. So that's on women. And I think we are making big progress across the continent, because we also know, as I said in my remarks, that 43% of smallholders in developing countries, they are women. And so you cannot leave them out of the whole equation. In everything that we do, in fact, we have what we call gender markers and gender indicators at the African Development Bank. So every project that is financed by the African Development Bank, you have to look at the gender indicators for it. You have to make sure that the project is going to disproportionately benefit women and children and vulnerable people. So we have the gender. In fact, for the gender markers, we categorize them depending on how many women are going to benefit, how many jobs will be created for women to be category 1, category 2. And there are projects that don't get approved if they don't meet the gender markers. So for us, it's very important, and I think it should be. And I think we are making some progress, but we are not there yet, and I think it will take a long time before you really see significant improvements in terms of that. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you for such a great discussion, and your answers have been really insightful. I wanted to go back to the decision-making process and Angela's question about financing fossil fuels. And looking back, can you see the way that the African Development Bank and the board has changed its tune on any topics? Like how has the attitude of the bank changed certain topics to enable more progressive financing and more innovative projects?
Very good question. Let me answer that question this way. You know, the board occasionally does change its views on things and what to be supported or not to be supported. For a very long period of time, the bank never supported investment in health in Africa. Despite the fact that there have been a lot of health crises and emergencies. Of course, whenever there are health emergencies, for instance, like the Ebola, the bank provided $225 million to those Ebola-affected countries at that time, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, just to recover. Now, COVID-19, the bank supported with a $10 billion COVID-19 facility, but no strategy on health for the bank because the bank did not want to make any commitment or do anything in terms of long-term health projects for Africa. So, but we convinced the bank. We put together a robust evidence. We said that apparently Africa was losing $2.4 trillion every year as a result of poor health, ill health, and so that the bank needed to do something in that area. So based on evidence, we were able to convince the bank, and now for the very first time in the history of the bank, we have a strategy on health, which is focusing mostly on health infrastructure for Africa. So now on fossil fuels, it doesn't mean that if the bank is not, the board is not in support of it at a point in time, it cannot happen. What is needed is robust evidence to show how, why, where this should happen. So that kind of evidence is part of what academia, think tanks, universities, research institutions should be generating. And to show the consequences, the repercussions, the merit, the demerits, the cons and pros of why this should happen on the continent. And I think the board is always willing to change its mind based on robust evidence and argument. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Babatunde, for your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.